welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
Welcome to CIHT's podcast. I'm Shalini Kumar, CIHT's Policy Advisor on Infrastructure. Today's podcast comes at a really interesting time for the transport sector, with COP26 having taken place last week and one of the major outcomes being the shift to electrifications, and it also being Road Safety Week, and the theme this year is Road Safety Heroes. I thought it'd be best to explore how TIR, a micromobility company, have paved their way with road safety for e-scooters. Joining us today is Georgia Heathman, Policy Manager for UK and Northern Ireland at TIR. Hi Georgia, welcome to CIHT's podcast. Do you want to tell us a bit more about your role and what you define micromobility to be?
Yeah, thanks Shalini, and thank you for having me today. This is really exciting. So my role is I'm Public Policy Manager for UK and Ireland for TIR. Essentially, what that means is working with local governments and other key stakeholder partners to ensure that everything we do is reflective of what that city or country might need. A big focus of that is on safety. Safety runs through everything we do, absolutely. We have a safety board with external partners that sit on that board to hold us to account. So all that engagement then feeds into our policies, and that's essentially what I lead on. And I work very closely with our operational teams and with our own other city teams, again, to put those policies into place and what that means for us as an organisation as we try and expand our services in this region.
Who are some of those external partners?
Yeah. So at the moment we have Transport for All. They are a pan-disability organisation mainly focused in London, but branching out their campaigning to have accessible transport for all, essentially. The Thomas Pocklington Trust, who represent blind and partially sighted people, as well as London Vision, who also represents more of that local London focus of the needs of blind and partially sighted residents in the city. And we also have David Davis, who is the chair for PACS, which is the Parliamentary Advisory Committee for Transport Safety. I'm amazed that I just remembered that acronym there. And then we also have representation from Cycling UK. So they are a very recent new partner who sit on that board. We've recently grown our micromobility offer in the UK. So we just introduced bikes in York a few months ago and introduced bikes to Islington last week. So given that new role that we're really taking on in UK and we're working with Cycling UK on the board as well, as a lot of the safety concerns and objectives and policies, really align across all micromobility. So yeah.
That's really exciting that you guys have some new cycles coming forward and stuff like that. What do you think are the main sort of barriers to encouraging road safety, and how do you think micromobility operators can overcome that?
Yeah, it's a really great question and a really big challenge for micromobility operators. I think there are a few things that operators can do. I mean, a lot of it is around education. So offering training as much as you possibly can to your users, whether that's an in-app based training or in-person training. We've been running a training partnership with Bikeworks, who are a sort of social enterprise in London, and they developed with bikeability trainers an e-scooter training program. We found actually really interesting, lots of very different groups go to the e-scooter training than you normally associate with e-scooter users. So a bigger proportion of women, older people. So that's a really interesting group to see how some people still feel like a bit of extra training would help them feel safe. And it also teaches you how to ride an e-scooter properly, and you assume you can just sort of pick one up and off you go. And having your foot position and such is great from a road safety perspective, being able to see all around you and things. So I think training is a really key part of what micromobility operators can do. And again, I think that broader engagement piece. So we engage a lot with different disability groups to advise them on where our parking bays are and such, so that they know on a certain street this is where a parking bay location is, to help protect their safety and independence walking around the city in which we're operating, as well as vice versa, them giving us advice on how we can potentially choose locations for parking that are in far safer locations, considering things such as lighting and CCTV and such. So training is a big part. I think infrastructure, one of the biggest barriers we find to safe use is infrastructure and lack of maybe cycle lanes, busy junctions that people then feel unsafe and then will tend to ride on a pavement. So, most of the time when we see pavement riding, it tends to be because people aren't feeling safe on the road. So then working with local authorities and government to make sure that there's funding for infrastructure and that it's being spent and used in the best way. So looking at where we see those hotspots of maybe poor, safe behaviour, that we can feed that into the decisions that are made on infrastructure and transport planning in future. So, a couple of things. And then finally, I think mainly is that vehicle design. So looking at making sure your vehicle is robust and it has possibilities of capping speeds, where it can be parked, where it can be used. So really designing the vehicle design with that safety all in mind. We added a lot of license plates to our e-scooters when we first rolled them out in York, because the sight loss councils there advised us that our license plates there weren't enough of them on the scooter in terms of this is the number that identifies which scooter it is. So if somebody witnesses poor behaviour, they can tell us and we can look into it and work with that user or remove them from the service. So we changed our license plates and we went to that classic black on yellow based on that engagement and advice that we had from them. And we also put them all over the scooter and then did a lot of engagement about where those license plates were. So I think looking at that vehicle design as well, it's a real benefit to, against sort of adversely to private e-scooter use where the vehicles aren't as designed so well. The rental scheme scooters are really heavy. They're capped at safe speeds. We recommend wearing a helmet and such. So I think those are the main three areas.
I feel like those are all really key points: education and infrastructure and vehicle design. And it makes me think, what are the things that you think needs to be done to reduce road casualties for e-scooter users, and more specifically combating things like the high rate of head injuries? So PACS, one of the external partners you work with, have reported that in 2021, there's been over 300 injury collisions, 9 fatalities within that, and 79 serious injuries. But within that, there was 24 head injuries. So what do you think needs to be done to just reduce that rate?
It's a great question. It's really hard with, also those figures that you've kind of listed there, that it's really important to talk of those as the private e-scooter vehicle injuries that we're seeing, rather than on the rental scooters. I mean, we had, in our first 6 months of operation, we had no serious incidents in York, and after hundreds of thousands of trips in London, I think we've only had 3 serious incidents that we would consider to be serious, as in somebody coming off an e-scooter or hurting themselves. So, I mean, I think that's, gives you an idea of the scale, that it's, really, really, really minimal. So in the case of that private e-scooter question, I think there is an issue potentially with some of the speeds that private e-scooters can be ridden at. I think as well, there's a lack of understanding again on that vehicle design. The wheels are quite much smaller on a private e-scooter, so that they are transportable and you can have more of a freedom of using it than a rental one. So I certainly think there is a big question, and certainly what that PACS report was calling for is looking at that private e-scooter design, that we're not getting the right data out of the trials to inform maybe private e-scooter legislation, unless it's looking at I think that vehicle design and some of the safety benefits, speed capping and such as I've mentioned, that you can then maybe think about, well, what would those standards be for a sort of private e-scooter manufacturer? So I think that's really something we're really keen on supporting PACT and certainly the DFT with, in our learnings and looking at how well it works for the rental trials. So how can we transform that to private use? And then on the head injuries, it's because it's hard to mandate for helmets. We don't mandate that helmets are used. We certainly encourage that they're used, but I always think it's somebody's personal choice to use a helmet. We actually do provide helmets on our e-scooters in York. We have a box that's attached to the vehicle, and you can pop out the helmet and it folds out, and you have access to a helmet then. Encouraging helmet use as much as possible. Certainly, I think a big communication campaign, insisting on that when manufacturers or suppliers are selling private e-scooters, they are raising those concerns and highlighting those risks so that people are aware. And then hopefully with a sort of rethink on what those speeds should be for some of those private vehicles where we are seeing really poor incidents, is maybe bringing those down, and then you combine that with a better, safer vehicle design and a helmet. Potentially you see different changes in the injuries that are happening. But yeah, I believe it's to do with the way you potentially can fall off an e-scooter, which results in a different type of injury. Though I certainly think, considering how well I think the trials have been quite a success, considering personal safety. Touch wood, and it's just awful to think that could still happen, and it is happening to users of private e-scooters. And I think there's a big case to be better in communicating the risks they're taking and trying to design a service that they can then use that's convenient, which means they're not using a private vehicle that's not as safe as a rental one.
I think it's really valuable that you mention it's the private e-scooter use that these figures showcase, and something which we're seeing currently in the UK more so than, say, certain European countries where e-scooter use is legal, is the fact that behaviours with the private e-scooter users, they tend to be ignoring the law. So what do you think should be done to manage those behaviours, and what are the key differences you see for e-scooter use in the UK compared to other European countries?
So to answer your first point on the private e-scooter use, I think what needs to happen is a far more better communication to consumers that buy private e-scooters from a shop in, say, Whole Foods or whoever. There is no legal requirement for a seller to explain to someone when they're buying a private e-scooter that it's not legal to use on a public road and it's only legal to use on a private road. I think there's a lot of therefore misunderstanding and not realizing the implications of you using your private e-scooter on a public road and what that could mean for you as an individual if you were, say, stopped by the police or such. So I think there's a lot of education that needs to take place there. And I think there should be better standards on some of those asks of when those vehicles are being sold, so that people can have better awareness of what the implications could be. I think looking to Europe and the differences we see in the markets there versus here, they are incredibly, we have a very regulated market, certainly in terms of the rental schemes. And we still have a lot of issues around parking and trying to get great parking locations that can expand a rental scheme, that can make sure that it's still ordered and protects inclusion, but also that the service can be convenient and accessible to use for someone who wants to go to the shops, so maybe needs to find an e-scooter bay near the shops versus near the house. So I think that in Europe you have a really unregulated service and there's sort of scooters everywhere. And I don't believe that the private e-scooter market is as prevalent as it is here, because you have a great rental scheme that's super convenient and means you don't necessarily need to look after your vehicle and maintain it and worry about it being stolen and such. So I think there's a difference there. There's also a difference between infrastructure and capability that we have here in the UK. A lot of European cities have a far greater culture of cycling and micromobility use, so they have much better cycling infrastructure that encourages the use of those vehicles, and again means that people can ride them in cycle lanes rather than on pavements where they may feel safer. So I think it's hard to compare, you know, some of our small UK cities with windy streets to maybe some bigger metropolises in Europe. But yeah, it's a really interesting kind of concept of when you look at these very different mature markets and why the UK is so regulated in the way that it is, but then also lacking on the other side too. Yeah.
So you say lacking, and that's usually like the culture, the behaviour side of things, and being more accepting and safer, let's say. And that's more so, as you say, micromobility in those European cities are seen more as a greater service, or it's more accessible. But in the UK, as you say, it is heavily regulated. Do you feel like micromobility operators should be more responsible to deliver those education campaigns to help shift those behaviours?
Yeah, for sure. I think it needs a collaborative effort between operators, between city authorities, the transport body that maybe is running a trial, as well as government and national government. For sure, it definitely doesn't come to just that one player. You know, part of our engagement that we do in London and in York is with local communities and working with organisations to try and reach people that are using private e-scooters, just to help like raise awareness of what those laws and concerns and implications could be for them. So totally, I think it is on the operators to do, but also a lot with those authorities that can, you know, we as an operator, it's difficult in a sort of commercial standpoint, you know, you to be seen, get off your private e-scooter and come and use our service. But, you know, there is an element of that, of course there is, but it's more about, well, what does that mean from a safety standpoint, from a sustainable standpoint as well? I mean, our vehicles can last far longer than some of the private ones can. Their lifespan is nearly 5 years, which is really, really great. So I think it's a collaborative effort for sure.
You mentioned e-scooter trials. Obviously you guys have been heavily involved, as you say, in York and London. What are the lessons learned from those trials? And I suppose, what do you think are the interventions that you feel have been successful in those trials?
So I think similar to some of those barriers that we spoke about to safety is also some of the lessons that we've learned. So similarly, we talked about parking and orderly parking and infrastructure and handing that space over. I certainly think what we've learned is that GPS quite often is what's used in the trials to control parking and where vehicles can be parked. And GPS has major limitations. Quite often your vehicle could think maybe that you're in a parking bay, but actually because of sort of dense environments and GPS being slightly inaccurate, you're actually 2 meters outside of a parking bay. So we use a mandatory parking zone system in both York and London that protects inclusion and slightly order rather than free floating, which is why you have your vehicles all over the streets and they don't need to be parked in a particular place. So we use mandatory parking zones. And we use camera positioning technology, which takes a 3D image of the area around that parking bay to ensure that the person parking their scooter is actually in the parking bay. I mean, that it delivers accuracy of up to 20 centimetres, which is far better than 2 meters. So I think learning that We've learned GPS certainly has its limitations. I think a mandatory parking zone system is really great for protecting inclusion in streets and making sure that you don't have adverse impacts on disabled people and other people that could be made vulnerable by these new things arriving in the city landscape. But I think as well we need to make it easier for local authorities to hand over a parking space to micromobility vehicles. That's been one of our greatest barriers to making sure a scheme can be convenient and expanded well and safely is through identifying parking. You only need one car parking space and you get 12 vehicles in one car parking space. So I think trying to make it easier for local authorities to be able to do that. Our sort of road regulation is very tough, and we have conversations with lots of authorities that say the difficulties and the time consuming nature of doing a transport road. Well, all of your listeners will know a TREO and how difficult that can be. So yeah, I think parking, and then again that infrastructure piece, making sure that infrastructure is going to be reflective of different users and, does kind of cross city instead of in and out of city centres as well to support those journeys that are taking place in suburbs and more residential areas. So really thinking about how you're designing your infrastructure in a city for those different user cases. And then I think finally it comes back to that training point. We have found the Bikeworks training that we've done has been incredibly valuable for lots of our users and amazing feedback. And I would love to see sort of that rolled out at a greater scale so that people could access it and then really feel that an e-scooter could be for them, or an e-bike as well. I mean, we certainly are multimodal, and e-scooters tend to be a little more scary because they're a bit new, and an e-bike is far more accessible. That's been around for nearly 200 years or however, so people feel like they can more access that. So I think training is a really big part of what we've learned from the trials as well.
So I think I'm gonna ask you to summarize. So I suppose the hot topic at the moment with COP26 is that electrification, and moving to EVs, e-bikes, e-scooters. But in the short term and making that shift to electrification, what do you think is the most important thing in this present moment for the UK and the transportation industry, especially for micromobility operators? What do you think is the most important thing to make the road environment safer?
The most important thing, I think the most important thing would be, communications and that training piece, and reminding all road users, whether that's somebody in a car or on a bike or on a scooter or walking down the street, that micromobility users are vulnerable, and they shouldn't be. I don't believe private e-scooter use should be so talked about so negatively as it is, and when individuals are trying to use potentially a sustainable mode. I think that really, it's about that consideration point, retraining communications that talk about how you should ride on a road in a safe position, remind sort of working with bus companies and freight organizations with their drivers to recognize and identify there is potentially a new user that is vulnerable, like a cyclist, and what that might mean for the way that they travel around. So I think that would probably be my main thing. And also, I guess as we try to move to that electrification and that modal shift out of cars, I think we really need to think about how we hand over space to micromobility vehicles, and we do that safely, that then frees up that critical, essential use on roads for emergency services, for freight to stores and such, and for people that really need that door-to-door transport and can't access the current offer of micromobility vehicle that is available. So I think, just making sure that we give that space, we consider it in our transport planning, we remove some of that space from cars, and we make sure that it's convenient for people to leave their car at home, and understand that a rental shared micromobility vehicle can do that 2-3 kilometre journey that they might otherwise do in their car.
I think that's a great answer. And it all comes back like full circle with what we initially spoke about, and that there's a greater lesson to be learnt with micromobility. And as the UK looks to shift to electrification, safety becomes increasingly important. With this shift, it is vital that we learn from best practice. And as you mentioned, those things like education, training, infrastructure, vehicle design, I think it's so important that there is the communication on that. And as you say, communication in the short term is key so that everyone can appreciate and accept that shift to electrification, as well as you mentioned, picking up the differences in culture and seeking the change for behaviours and looking towards use of sustainable transport and even delivering micromobility as a service in order to move away from private car ownership. So I think that's been a really great conversation, and I've really enjoyed talking to you today, Georgia. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for providing such valuable insight on how the industry can shift to deliver safety within e-scooter use.
Yeah, of course, it's been a real pleasure. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you very much.